Hello and welcome to the Shanty Show, the show about shanties. Today we are very fortunate to be joined in our final episode of season 1 by Martin Hugill, one of the sons of the legendary Stan Hugill.
So before we dive into the episode, just a couple quick housekeeping notes. As James mentioned, this is the end of season 1. If you've been watching this on our YouTube channel, thank you. And make sure that you subscribe to the audio version because from here on out, we're going to be doing mostly audio episodes with the occasional video special. That said, if you are listening to this particular episode right now, I would strongly encourage you to pop on over to YouTube as well. Martin's been very generous with sharing some of the documents, pictures, and artifacts that he's collected over the years from his dad. And we have spliced those into the video version of this show, and it's really worth your time. But without that, or with that said, I guess, without that.
With it.
So with it. With all of that.
Including all of the above.
Off we go.
To me, way.
As I was a-rolling down Paradise Street, way, hey, blow the man down, a big Irish stopper I chanced for to meet. Give me some time to blow the man down. He says you're a black baller by the cut of your hair. Way, hey, blow the man down. He says you're a black baller by the clothes that you wear. Give me some time to blow the man down. You've sailed in some packet that flies the black ball. Way, hey, blow the man down. You've robbed some poor Dutchman of boots, clothes and all. Give me some time to blow the man down. Oh, policeman, you do me great wrong. Way, hey, blow the man down. I'm a flying fish sailor just home from Hong Kong. Give me some time to blow the man down. Well, I stove in his face and I smashed in his jaw. Way, hey, blow the man down. Hey, young fella, you're breaking the law. Give me some time to blow the man down. Well, they gave me 6 months in old Walton town. Way, hey, blow the man down. For a booting and a kicking and a blowing him down. Give me some time to blow the man down. Well, we're Liverpool born, we're Liverpool bred. Way, hey, blow the man down. Strong in the arm, boys, and thick in the head. Give me some time to blow the man down. Oh, we're a Liverpool ship with a Liverpool crew. Way, hey, blow the man down. A Liverpool mate and a scout skipper too. Give me some time to blow the man down. Well, it's blow the man up, bullies, blow the man down. Way, hey, blow the man down. Blow him right back into Liverpool town. Give me some time to blow the man down.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great Liverpool shanty to start us off.
Yeah, it was one of Dad's, he would always, I think he used to start his concerts off with that particular one. Yeah. And I think you'll find the lyrics in Shanties from the Seven Seas are actually, I'm not even sure whether those lyrics are actually in Shanties from the Seven Seas. I think they're the ones that he used to sing sort of latterly that I can really remember. But yeah.
Well, that's one of the themes we've sort of run into in a few of our conversations, how the lyrics could change from one performance to another with most shanty groups. So I think that's within the tradition too.
Absolutely, and when you think the whole, when they were working on ships, a good shantyman would just make up lyrics.
There was no use when you started on the rope pulling to say halfway through it, please sir, I don't know any more verses. You had to carry on with the job, and then you'd improvise something like a calypso singer. The first few verses were all traditional, and when you got through them, you could do what you like. You had to be careful though. You could sing about the crew, your shipmates. If you were a good poet, make them up as you went along, about the bad grub, and perhaps even get as far as talking about the captain was no good. But the best thing about this, because there was an unwritten law where you could sing about all the vicissitudes of the ship, but you could not say these things point blank without music, otherwise you might be traced up to the yard arm.
And that must have been quite a skill. That's certainly not a skill that I've ever achieved. But yeah, so I suppose that they would have changed, you know, sort of all the time, really. And I suppose the tunes would change as well. You know, slight variations came in. I think I've got to say, I think there's probably been a lot more variations in tunes of shanties and the lyrics more recently. And whether those have come from other sources or whether they've just been, you know, changed by the performers at that particular time, I don't really know. Songs like John Cherokee come into mind. Sung in a way now, if you hear people singing John Cherokee, it will not be the way that I ever remember Stan singing it, or the way it's actually written in the book. So, but then again, I think perhaps that, you know, Stan, I think would, you know, you'd have to say was no musician. He was a singer, but he wasn't a musician. He didn't, you know, he couldn't write music. I don't think he really understood the intricacies of music, it would be fair to say. But he had a brother called Harold, and we knew Harold briefly. He died in 1965, I think. He was a great musician. So he played the piano, he played the violin, he played the mandolin, and it was him who sort of transcribed from, I think Stan even says, from his wild singing. He had to put and make sense musically, which he did on, if I might take this, on this particular mandolin.
Oh, no,
and this was the very mandolin that was left to me by Harold, and he, yeah, that was the one that did all the transcribing of the tunes from his very wild singing. Yes,
I was noticing yesterday, flipping through the preface and the intro to the book and a few of the pages too, that Stan had his own notation for with the squiggly line over where the
Yodels.
poop or the holler. Yeah.
Yes.
the hitches, right?
The hitches. That's right. Yeah. He certainly did. Yeah.
But I find that fascinating that he really made a point to include the hitches where those would have been, because that's something it's impossible to notate on paper.
And I'm sure you've probably heard things on YouTube, which on the live performances where he probably did it more than he would have done on the recordings, I would imagine.
Oh, South Australia's been native home.
Heave away, all away.
From there I never more shall roam.
We're bound for South Australia. All away, your rolling king. Heave away, all away. All away, you'll hear me sing. We're bound for South Australia.
I mean, I haven't watched an awful lot of stuff of his on YouTube, but I certainly have, you know, the original record shanties from the 70s. I don't know whether you've actually come across the record.
I didn't know that it existed, to be honest.
Oh, right, yeah. I think I think they came out. I think the book came out in 61. I think the record came out in 62. So he used a lot of the old worthies from, you know, the folk scene, you know, the burgeoning folk scene at the time, to actually help him in the choruses.
Okay.
And one of the guys, I think he played in the, I think they were called the Celebrated Working Man's Band, and they were almost like a house band of a lot of the albums that came out in the early 60s of Ewan McColl and A.L. Lloyd and people like that. And I think Alf Edwards actually played the melodeon, although he was actually a concertina player, on some of the songs that needed, you know, that sort of accompaniment. Because Dad did actually play the melodeon himself, but I think I'd be right in saying I don't think he ever played the melodeon to a live audience.
Okay.
You know, we heard him playing at home, and there are several reel-to-reel tapes that we still have, and I hope are still in good condition. You know, he actually sang into this old, you know, reel-to-reel thing, and he played the accordion then. But otherwise, I'm not aware that he ever did publicly. But,
Okay.
mm.
Well, I know for a fact I would love to hear some of those recordings if they ever do get digitized. Well,
I'm just actually looking across now to the melodeon that he actually used to play. Yeah, I mean, he used to play, you know, he was no great expert on it, but he could play it well enough to accompany himself on songs, you know, in private. Let's put it like that, yeah.
And your grandfather played the melodeon and
He did.
sang Songs of the Sea as well, right?
And my great-grandfather, because great-grandfather and my grandfather, as well as sharing names, they were both called Henry James Hugill, as was the fashion of the day, and they both had very similar careers. They both followed similar careers in that my great grandfather was a what was it? He was a petty officer in the Royal Navy. That's a very interesting time when sail was giving way to steam, and it would have been about the time of the American Civil War, the 1860s, and then get into the 1870s. And he did a couple of lovely wool pictures, like sailors would do at that time, of two ships that he was on, the Leander and the Doris, both of which are still in my mum's house down in Abu Dhabi. And yeah, luckily there are two of them, so there's me and my brother, so we shouldn't have too many problems when it comes to sort of splitting things up. But yes, and yeah, so they both had these similar careers in the Royal Navy. I don't think my grandfather was a non-commissioned officer. I think he was like a yeoman of signals, something like that. And but he served in the training brigs. That there were these training brigs that the Royal Navy operated right up until nearly until the First World War, I think. And yeah, he served on those. So they'd all had sail experience. And of course, then Stan decided, he decided to take the other course and join the devil's work, the merchant service. So yeah.
So Stan, if I'm correct in thinking that Stan was born in as a Coast Guard cottage, I think, right, in Hoylake.
Yeah, he was. Quite interestingly, I was up there not so long ago, walking the sort of coastal path around the Wirral Peninsula, and we were looking to see where those cottages might have been. And I've later now discovered that they were actually bulldozed, and there's like a hotel in the place where they used to be, which was a bit disappointing. But yeah, he was born on apparently it was a really stormy night. There was I don't know what type of ship it was, but this ship had gone ashore on the revetment off Hoylake, and his father, who was then serving in the Coast Guards, he took the crew out to rescue the people from the ship. So he wasn't around at the time of Stan's birth. He was doing very important things, saving lives, I suppose. And yeah, so that's yes, born on the what was it, the 19th of November 1906.
Kind of a legendary story, even that like just the story of birth right there. Yes. And now he ran off to sea when he was about 14 years old or so when he joined the Merchant Navy, right?
Now, do you know, I'm gonna have to explode some myths here.
Okay.
Because I've actually got a copy of well, to call it a diary, it's just loose sheets of paper that we discovered. After Stan died, we sort of went through a lot of his papers, and this was one. And the earliest letter I can find is when he went to sea on a steamer, and it was the it belonged to the Commonwealth and Dominion line that I think later became known as the Port Line, and that was in 1924. So if my maths is correct, he would have actually been 17. Because I think actually what happened was that he'd gone to school all over the place because his father had been moved around Britain with the Coast Guard Service. He spent a lot of his time in school. So he left school. I think he caught Spanish flu because he was quite ill. And so I think the school leaving age at the time was 14, and he left at 13 and a half. And apparently the headmaster came knocking on the door asking when he was going to come back, and he was shouting downstairs to his mum, tell him I'm not coming back, tell him I'm not coming back, and he didn't. And that was like the end of his sort of formal education. But he went to work for his uncle, who incidentally had been a ship's carpenter. So there was a lot of, on both sides of the family, there was quite a lot of, nautical influence. And presumably he must have stayed there for quite a while, because in the first letter home, he actually states, this is far better than the rotten trades. And the trades being this building trade, presumably, that he'd been with his uncle in. So I think, he was, about 17. And that was a voyage from Birkenhead or Liverpool to Philadelphia, and then down into the Gulf of Mexico, and then through the Panama Canal to New Zealand. And that
now, is this the trip where he was shipwrecked in New Zealand, or is that?
And he was shipwrecked. Yes, which a little further, a few pages on, he says, you can't guess what happened. We've been shipwrecked. And anyway, I think they came home. They were as distressed British seamen or something like that. And he went out again fairly soon afterwards in another steamer from the Port Line, and then he went to I think he went to a Maori pa. They went up country to avoid the police, because even in those days it was illegal, to jump ship. They had to climb the dock gates in Wellington, and him and a guy called Jock. And I think they both, after being with the Maoris for some time, they went to a farm, to a sheep station, I should say, and the farmer, he was quite amazed how a lot of runaway sailors had ended up at that farm, and he said they were all really good on horseback. So maybe something to do with the balance, or whatever. And Stan ended up working, 2 sheepdogs from a horse with a whip. None of this 2 hands on the reins thing. It was, one hand on the rein, one hand, with the whip, and rounding up sheep on a sheep station. And I think he had to go into a place, Gisborne. He had to go down into Gisborne to take some message to the post office or something. And it was whilst he was there that he saw this, and she must have been a very small schooner. I think she was only about 57 foot in length, according to, where's his book now? Out of Auckland, the book is where they mention the Saucy Kate. And she's a pretty small schooner. And she was doing sort of coasting runs around New Zealand, and he made quite a few trips on her, and that was his first introduction to a sailing ship. And he used to tell this story that he was he'd been asked if he could steer, and of course I could steer. The arrogance of youth. Of course I could steer. But he had actually steered these big port line steamers. But steering a sailing ship, quite a bit of a different thing, because so he went to the wheel, and the mate said something like, by the wind, and Stan sort of thought, repeat the command, by the wind. And he was thinking, well, where the hell's the wind? What the hell am I meant to do? He really didn't know what he was doing. And he put the ship aback, and all the sails on the, all the fore and aft sails began to sort of shake. And there was a guy up aloft with, I suppose, these days, the amusing name of Big Mac. And he was nearly knocked from aloft. So came down quick as he could, just went straight over to Stan, smacked him straight into the scuppers. And he said, ever since then, I learnt to steer by the wind. So that was his first experience on a sailing ship.
And now, would that have been when he first encountered shanties as well, do you think?
Well, he always said that shanties were never really sung on fore and afters, so I would possibly doubt it. But I think, well, not on board ship anyway, but when he was, he met a lot of people, you know, in the various dives in the sailor towns of Auckland and Gisborne or whatever. He met a certain guy called Paddy Griffiths, who was the guy who gave him his version of Rolling Down Through Maui. And it's strange that, you know, that was one of the first ones that he must have come across. Well, apart from all the stuff that he'd learnt from his father and grandfather as well, because there was a certain, you know, amount of knowledge there too. But Rolling Down to Old Maui. And I don't think he ever put it in print, not until Songs of the Sea. I think it's McGraw-Hill, and he put it in that particular book. And but I don't think he ever performed it until about the early 1970s. I think he said that, well, the story he told was he had I live in a town called Shrewsbury in County Shropshire, and Shrewsbury back in those days always had a very thriving folk club, and I suppose it was the nearest folk club to Aberdyfi, although it was right across Wales. On the borders, and so he always had quite an affinity with the Shrewsbury Folk Club, and there are still people now that I talk to, some the older guys who still understand from those days, and I think they were coming back from a folk festival. It was the National Folk Festival at Loughborough, and Shrewsbury Folk Club in its entirety with Stan. And they were all coming back, and that's when he first sang that version of Rolling Down to Old Maui. So that was quite a time from when he actually learned it to to actually giving it a public airing. Yeah.
Wow. So I'm curious if Stan had some introduction to the shanty tradition, sort of in the midst of the larger sort of nautical music from being a young man at home. And then you're saying he's also picking up some songs from these sailors in these sailor towns in places like New Zealand. I know in the Shanties from the Seven Seas, he talks at length about the sort of Afro-Caribbean songs and sort of the
That comes a lot later.
Okay, so what's
I say a lot later. In years, probably not that long, but he'd done sort of several things, been on several ships, including going to. He actually, from New Zealand, he went to Australia,
okay,
and then walked places like the 90-mile desert near, not Port Melbourne. What was the other place? Port Adelaide. Yeah, he went on a bit of a survival thing, really, because 90 miles doesn't sound a lot, but I think in a desert that's probably quite a way. And somebody did. Somebody in a car drove past, and I don't know why he didn't pick him up, or perhaps he was going in the opposite direction, but he gave him some water that was actually only really fit to go in the radiator of the car. It tasted awful, but it kept him going, which is why he was always a bit disdainful of survival programs like in the Outward Bound and things like that, when they had to go up into the mountains for a couple of days. He said, well, yeah, not quite the survival things that he had to go through. And being on the sailing ship, I mean, what a survival skill that was, gosh, going around Cape Horn. But yes, so anyway, he sailed on various vessels out of Australia, and incidentally, although the Garth Pool was where he sort of finally got that title, as Shantyman, I think, came from his days on the Garth Pool, but he had tried to join her several years earlier in Port Adelaide, but she'd had a complete complement of crew. And remember that we're talking about a time sort of in the late 20s when it was the Great Depression. Seamen were looking for jobs. I think it was pretty hard to get a job on a steamer. Probably slightly easier on a sailing ship because there weren't so many people willing to do that or had the skills, to do that. But and he decided he was with a whole group of them when they were hanging around in Port Adelaide, and he decided he would do better if he went on his own. So he stowed away on a cattle ship, all amongst all the crap and the of the cattle down below, and she was bound for Melbourne, and anyway, so he managed to get out. I don't know how he got through all the authorities, but there he joined a vessel called the Gustav, which was owned by a guy called Hermann Engels at the time of Germany, and in fact it was quite interesting because it was that was then due to be its last voyage under the German flag, because after that voyage she was bought by I'm sure you've heard his name, Gustav Ericsson of Finland, who ran the last sort of large sailing ship fleet in the world, really, and he changed the name to the Melbourne. But yeah, Stan sort of went around Cape Horn, so he sailed from I don't know if it's Geelong or Geelong. She was towed down from Melbourne anyway, to there with a full cargo of wheat, and oh, that's right. They all they all complained about the porridge being sour. So the captain had a bit of a rebellion on his hands, and Stan had probably only been on the ship for a few hours, and anyway, they were all logged. The whole crew had been logged. Anyway, but they obviously got over that, and she was towed down to Geelong and then sailed for the Horn, east about for the Horn. And I think when he was down there, he in those high latitudes, I think she was quite iced up, and he was going over the foot of shrouds, and he put his knee over onto the top, which was really icy. The ship lurched, and he found himself holding by one hand, hanging over the sea as she went over. And he thought, God, that must have been a pretty frightening experience. Luckily, she lurched back again, took him back into the top, and he managed to get himself. And I think that was possibly the nearest he'd come to meeting his maker, really, on that particular occasion.
So, okay, this is an action-packed story. He's what age at this point?
22.
Okay.
Yeah.
My goodness.
22 there. Yeah. Anyway, they. I know he was singing shanties then, because he mentions in shanties from the Seven Seas. I think the shanty Rolling Home. He says that the German shantyman sang it in German, in Plattdeutsch, in Low German, and he would be singing "Rolling Home to Dear Old Hamburg," sort of thing, and then Stan would be singing alternate verses in English, and they sang that as she was being walked in on her own capstans into I think it was the Queen's Dock in Belfast. So I know he was definitely singing shanties then, and then of course, when he joined the Garth crew, although she had a crew of pretty much green hands, really, a lot of people at that time were just joining sailing ships just to make one voyage, just for the experience of it. And there was a major, army major on board who was obviously doing it just for he was just like supercargo, just doing it for the fun of it, really. And but luckily, the captain, the master of the vessel, Captain Thompson, was a very enthusiastic shanty singer himself, and so he managed to encourage all these greenhorns who had probably never even heard a shanty to actually sing these songs, and that's where Stan sort of sang. Well, it became, if you've got a master of a vessel who is, into singing shanties, then that's pretty good, isn't it, really? Because interestingly, into the 30s, I mentioned Gustav Ericsson. I think Basil Greenhill, the maritime historian, says that shanties were never sung really on the last of those Finnish four-masted barks, and I think that's also borne out in Eric Newby's book as well. But yeah, they didn't tend to sing shanties there, which is why I figure he must have had given that title of the last shantyman, which was given him by, I think it was one of the newspapers who wrote about the wreck of the Dartpool. Yeah, I still have the house flag of the Marine Navigation Company, a little moth-bitten, but it's still there. We have a belaying pin that he managed to swipe. He was very good at doing that sort of thing. And a boat's compass, which has since had a little brass plaque put on it saying that it was from the Dartpool and you know where and when it was wrecked.
So I've got sort of a bunch of different questions that are running through my mind right now. But I was wondering, now you're mentioning the last line of sailboats were really, it was run by a Finnish owner.
Yeah, Gustav Eriksson, yeah.
Okay, and I recall reading in the Shanties from the Seven Seas, Stan talks about a few sort of cultural groups. So one of which he's saying is, well, going back to the hitches, I believe he says something to the extent that it was something that the black sailors could do incredibly well, and that, you know, everyone else tried to imitate it, and no one really came that close to it.
That close to it. No, that's right. Yeah.
And then secondly, he was saying of the white sailors that the Scandinavians were the best singers.
Okay.
And another one that he says is that a lot of these songs were sort of maybe not documented, but were sort of carried on by the Irish sort of sailing johns out of Liverpool and New York. So to me, the sort of three interesting sort of cultural groups, and you're mentioning the German singers too as well.
Yeah, and of course that's always carried on sort of into recent times. And their sort of thing as a revival seems to be these shanty choirs, right? Which certainly was quite a big thing in Germany, and I think probably in the Netherlands as well. Yeah, but Stan sort of picked up those Afro-Caribbean shanties from, you've mentioned Harding and Tobago Smith, Harry Lauder, in inverted commas, and that was then going into the 30s, after he'd made a couple of voyages out from Britain, which turned out to be like delivery passages of two vessels, one in 1930 and one in 1933. The first one I think he went out was the Goldfinch, and he described her as a decrepit wooden vessel, and they had real problems with her, including almost losing their rudder. The cap on the lower mast cap snapped, and they had to repair that with wire seizings, and God knows what it sounded. Yeah, it sounded all pretty rough, really. Yes, so when they'd obviously made the voyage to British Guiana, as it was then, Guyana now, and to Georgetown, and the idea was that these vessels were going to be used to carry sugar down from the plantations down the Essequibo, Demerara, and the Berbice rivers, bringing the stuff down to the liners that would be bringing the sugar back to Europe, presumably, which is why they were sort of flat-bottomed vessels, which weren't ideal for an ocean voyage, really, but they made it. And then, of course, the captain and the mate, the master and the mate, they would be shipped back home, whereas the rest of the crew, the four of them, really had to make their own way. And I think that's so he went on the beach basically, and ended up in Trinidad, just across the Boca there from Guyana, and they made a living by tattooing, he and his friend, because Stan still carried the tattoos up his arm that his friend had done. I think it was Bill Fuller, the name of his shipmate. So Bill Fuller did all Stan's tattoos, and Stan did all his. But to make a living, because they were basically beach bums. They had, they were a pain in the backside to the police on the island because they didn't know what to do with them. And so they'd be tattooing people, and they ran out of ink. And a local lad said that if you cut open the stone of a mango, it had this sort of black fluid in it that made very good ink for tattooing. So that's, God knows what sort of infections they must have caused on people. I really don't know. But the chief of police called them in because he'd found that a lot of his officers had got bandaged arms, and apparently they'd been tattooing these policemen as well. And then it's on those adventures on the islands where he met people like Harding, Tobago, and Harry, and they were. You got to remember, he was still a pretty young bloke at the time. He wouldn't have been in his 30s at this time, and these guys, they were hardened seamen, but I would imagine they'd been really pleased to sort of pass on what they would, those songs that they were doing to this enthusiastic youngster, and it's quite interesting because as well as the loose pages I've got of it, I've also got a little notebook where he notes down all the shanties that he's learned, and all the shanties that he wants to learn, tunes to play on the melodeon, which generally aren't even folk songs, they're just sort of popular tunes of the day. And I suppose in a way that little book was the genesis of Shanties from the Seven Seas, because that had all the information in it.
Now I do want to jump to that as well, but before we get to 1961 and I believe a broken ankle injury that caused the book to be written in the first place. Stan was also a sailor in World War II, and he was in a German prisoner of war camp, I believe. Is that correct?
Indeed, that's right. He was, I think, in about 1934 or 35. He switched from sail to steam. He joined, although it must be said, he had actually been in several vessels, motor vessels and steamships prior to that, the biggest one being the Holbein of the Lamport and Holt line, and he went on that between the Gustav and the Garthpool, going out to Buenos Aires, which is where he had his adventures with gauchos, and again, a very interesting time it must have been, really. Yeah, he joins the steamships. I think his first steamship was the Helenus, and I think that was about 1934, 35. And she was a Blue Funnel liner, and of course this connection with the Blue Funnel takes him right up to more sort of recent times, because, well, I say recent, I mean the 1960s or the 1950s, and he was on a Blue Funnel in 1941, and he was on a ship called the Automaton, and they must have been just off the northern point of Sumatra. Is it called the Sunda Strait? Anyway, and they were spotted by this raider. So anyway, cut a long story short, they were sunk, and they landed in Bordeaux, were taken up to the prisoner of war camp just outside of Bremen, where he spent the rest of the war, really, and by all accounts, not in a very good shape. Well, I don't think so as any of them were by the end of the war. I mean, they were fed decently, but it must have been a hard time, very anxious time for people, not knowing whatever was going to happen to them. Anyway, they were eventually freed and came back, and immediately they took them to hospital to sort of see how they were getting on, and he had got this sort of flair for languages, and whilst he was out east, with the Blue Funnel Line going out to Japan and places like that. Oh, he was also, yeah, because he was in Shanghai at the time of the Japanese Sino-Japanese War, and there's documents that I've got saying about the curfews that had been put in for the sailors on the ships that had come in to Shanghai to warn them, you know, the Japanese had put the curfews in place. And so yeah, that's quite an interesting sort of document. But anyway, say that they he'd learned Japanese, and I think the Blue Funnel Line put him through university just after the war to learn to, you know, hone up his Japanese, and that was in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS as it's known now, and well, that was basically a diploma course that he was on. It was a 2-year course, but when he came out, he was approached by some of the bigwigs in the Blue Funnel Line, because of course he wanted to go back. He wanted to, you know, to find a ship to go back on. But I think, you know, they must have thought that quite a lot of these sailors were sort of damaged goods in a way, really, having spent this time in the prisoner of war camp. So they said, well, look, there's this new venture. Well, it wasn't that new, because I think it started in 42. The Outward Bound in Abu Dhabi, which was the first Outward Bound school to be opened, and they and then he went there, and I think Kurt Hahn of Gordonston School and Lawrence Holt, who was the managing director or whatever, the Blue Funnel Line, they actually, you know, formed that, and I think Kurt Hahn and another chap called Hilary Tunstall Burns were the ones, when Stan was laid up with his broken foot, they're the ones who gave him the proverbial kick up the arse to actually, you know, look, you need to put all this stuff down on paper, which is when he wrote the book, because he had been having shanty nights with the lads at the Outward Bound, you know, during the 50s, and Hilary would accompany him on the fiddle, and yeah, so that's how the book was basically started. But as I say, you know, all the knowledge had come from, you know, quite a few years before. I mean, he obviously did do a lot of research into, you know, stuff. He had a lot of correspondence, and I think that was quite an interesting story, that he met this this guy, a German chap called Rainer von, because interestingly, Stan had no animosity towards Germans whatsoever, and in fact even went over in, what would it be, about 1950, to train the boys on the Pamir and the Passat, the 2 German four-masted barks. Quite a few who had been Hitler Youth during the war, no animosity whatsoever. And anyway, so yeah, old Rainer von Barsewitsch, he wrote to him and said, you know, did he know of any people who might be knowledgeable on, you know, German shanties, you know, in researching the book. And he said, well, yeah, I do know someone actually, and he's an admiral in the German Navy. And Stan said, oh, that would be really good. What's his name? And it turned out that it was the captain of the raider that had actually sunk him during the war. So I thought that was quite amusing. So he wrote a letter to him and said, you know, I think you owe me one. And he did. He actually sent him, you know, a load of German shanties back.
Well, one of the things that really strikes me is that Stan was truly a Renaissance man. He was, you know, even though he left school at an early age, we've talked about how he was a polyglot. He could pick up languages anywhere. I know for a fact he was quite well published from the Bosun's Locker, which is from the Spinners magazine. I found this one.
Oh,
here.
you've got that. Oh, yeah, that's the. Is that the Jenkins copy of it? Yeah, yeah.
I'm not too sure. Then I found the Shanties and Sailor Songs, of course.
Right. Well, those two are the same book, aren't they?
Are they? This
Is
one,
that-
the little.
I think they are. I think one was published by Herbert Jenkins and one was published in America.
Oh, Yeah, you're right. This is the Herbert Jenkins one.
Yeah.
And I managed to pick up Sailor Town.
Which seems to have a much better cover on your copy.
Is that right?
Yes.
And then, of course, the one you show there, the Songs of the Seas.
Ah, right. So you're familiar with all of these ones.
And I even went so far as to get the German language Windjammer Liebe.
Yeah.
Which seems to be the German version of Songs of the Sea.
Yeah.
And my prized possession here, this was something that was gifted to us in Mystic a few years ago. And it's an earlier copy of Shanties from the Seven Seas, with the autograph in there from 1980. So that's
fantastic. Yes, that's brilliant.
But one story, just before we move on to the inception of Shanties from the Seven Seas, one story that we heard in, I believe it was in Mystic, that there was a National Geographic documentary done about one of the German prisoner of war camps, and they found this big painting, and they were sort of confused, where did this painting come from? And it was a backdrop apparently for a prisoner's production of The Pirates of Penzance. And the story is that Stan would have painted this backdrop, and apparently in the camp, what was happening is if the prisoners were too weak, they'd eventually sort of get executed by the prison guards. And so that Stan had made sure that even the most sort of feeble prisoners had a small role to play in the production to show that they were well enough. Is this something you've heard of? And I guess what I'm alluding to is the fact that he's a great painter as well. But I was curious if you could sort of comment on.
Do you know on that particular one? I'd have to say you have the better with me on that one.
But he was an amazing painter as well, and I just find that remarkable. Especially given he had left school, or maybe because he had left school at such a young age. He's very creative type.
Yeah. Apparently, one of the stories he used to tell was that when he was in school, they had, so he'd shown quite an early flair for drawing and painting, and I think as a class they were asked to draw a post box, and all these kids did these classic British post boxes as they were then, and when Stan did his, he did the post box, the street, houses in perspective, going away, and so yeah, that was something. Yeah, he had obviously from an early age, and yeah, I mean he did a lot of paintings of sailing ships. Abu Dhabi was still is quite a visitor. Sort of a lot of people, visit Abu Dhabi. They'd heard that he was, that he was a bit of a character in Abu Dhabi, and they'd say, "Oh, would you do us a painting?" And when I think about, he was selling them for a song, really, and yeah, they must have been rubbing their hands with glee, really. But he whenever I came to visit, because at this time I was actually living, I don't know, North Wales, Mid Wales, or in Shrewsbury. I would come home on a fairly regular basis, and there would always be a painting on the easel in the corner of the room. Now, you've got to imagine that, 34 Copper Hill Street is not a big house. It's just basically a living room, a kitchen, bathroom, and all on level, 2 bedrooms upstairs, and that's it. And he used to paint in this corner, but he managed to paint some really nice sort of seascapes, really. He did have his artistic temperamental moments, it must be said. I think we told this story the last time we were in Mystic over in 2019, which was actually the last Mystic festival. I believe, yeah.
Yeah.
And sadly, probably the last that will be. Anyway, so we were meant to be having a chat about Stan on stage. I don't know how interesting it was to the audience, but anyway, there we go. And that one of the stories I think my brother told it was when he actually got he painted this picture of a ship, and despite what I said earlier about with the postbox and all that, the perspective on this was like shite. It was it really wasn't very good. And he'd obviously asked my mum, who said, "No, I don't really like that." And then me and Phil came home on holidays or something, and he asked us about it and said, "Oh no, we don't like that. And he had this like fit of pique, and he just squirted a load of oil paints on the palette and just like across it, and completely, covered the canvas just in this one colour. When it had dried, he painted another painting over it, and it was probably one of the best ones he'd ever done. And it was, so he did have that artistic temperament.
Maybe this might be a good time to talk about the sailing school, Martin. I'm not sure. And
the Outward Bound.
And how Stan broke his ankle. I believe he was leaping up from behind bushes. I've heard some kind of story like that.
It wasn't quite like that, but he was. There was like a low stone wall that used to bound the old coal yard from the road, and the schools on the other side. And he thought he was still a youngster and sort of tried to leap over it, and it all went wrong, and he broke his foot. So he was laid up for 6 weeks or so on that particular occasion. And that's when he thought, great opportunity. So he started writing it. It's funny because as a very young child, I suppose that would have been maybe about 59, 60, something like that. So I would have been very young. But I can remember him. He used to sit at this chair right by the window and had one of these sort of fold down tables with the legs that sort of drop down. And he'd be doing these sort of pen and ink drawings that you can now find in Shanties from the Seven Seas. And I can remember when he was sort of I remember he did the map of the world with the mermaid on it, or what. I was always fascinated by mermaids. When that film came out, it was fantastic. But he used to actually do drawings and pen and ink drawings of mermaids for me, actually. Very good they were too. But he tried his hand actually drawing and painting anything, because I've always loved railways and steam locomotives and whatever. And he would even do the Wild West type of steam locos with the big smokestack, the balloon smokestacks on them and things like that, the cowcatchers. And they were very good representations, considering he didn't really know much about steam engines. But he could turn his hand to many things.
So he was drawing these from the top of his head then? He wasn't looking at an image?
No, he would just do them from scratch. Like he would, when he was singing in the folk clubs, he would often ask for a blackboard, and whilst he was talking, he would just do a map of the world, just like that. And that was a certain sort of skill, really. Really just to illustrate where the sailor towns of the world were and things like that.
So he was doing these illustrations at the same time that he was jotting down the lyrics to the shanties of the Seven Seas.
Notes and absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
And then at one point, your uncle came in to help him sort of notate the melodies. Is that correct?
No, I think that's. We still had a house in Liverpool at that time, and Dad would go up as a family, and Dad would spend time with Harold then. And I think that's when, because there wasn't any that sort of correspondence. It would be quite difficult to do. You had to have been there. Mm-hmm. So that was all done, when we went on holiday. Well, it was a holiday for us anyway, but I'm not so sure it was a holiday for Stan. But and of course, we sold the house when Harold died, and that was the end of our Liverpool adventures. But
so when you think about what your dad was trying to achieve in writing the book, what do you think the most important things he would want people who are just learning about shanties to know that they might miss if they weren't paying attention?
Their origins. He was a bit of a he was a bit of a stickler for origins of things, and would would always, say to audiences where he got things from, or certainly, back in the day. He thought that was actually quite important, and that was something that he sort of instilled into us when, although we weren't necessarily singing shanties, but singing folk songs. He always said, when you're introducing a song, it's quite important to actually say where it came from. That so you have like that overall knowledge of the song, and perhaps your singing might be influenced by the knowledge that you have of it.
We spoke with a few people, most recently Heather Wood, and she was talking about growing up post-war in Britain, and there's a show by William Appleby called Singing Together, and one of the types of songs that they would include in this program were sea shanties and other folk songs. And it occurs to me now, the first edition of Shanties from the Seven Seas would have been published in 1961. That coincides pretty nicely with sort of the folk revival of the 1960s, with some of those seeds sort of being planted on BBC Radio too. How did that sort of line up for Stan? And was that something that was unexpected? Was it something that he enjoyed sharing his knowledge with a broader folk community, or how did that work out?
Well, I think he was actually doing things for the BBC. Before Shanties from the Seven Seas. Previous to that, I think the main exponents of shanties in Britain, at least, were people like Bert Lloyd and Ewan MacColl. And Ewan MacColl had a band, the Critics Group, and they did a couple of albums that were purely of shanties. I'm not quite sure how well Bert Lloyd and my dad actually got on, because they were sort of treading on each other's ground, really. I suppose Bert Lloyd had that field to himself, and this upstart came along who seemingly had a lot more experience as a shanty man. But yeah, I don't know whether you'd include this at all, but my dad always reckoned that Bert Lloyd, he would always acknowledge him in print, always, with the estimable Stan Hugill, the knowledgeable Stan Hugill, and things like that. But if they ever sort of crossed paths at a festival, very little would ever be said, until my dad brought my mum to the folk festival, this particular folk festival, and then suddenly Bert Lloyd seemed to be very interested in my dad. Because what you've got to remember is my mum was a fair bit younger than my father.
I think I read that somewhere, that when your dad met your mom, Stan was older than her dad. Is that correct?
By a year.
By a year, okay.
Yeah. My maternal grandfather was born in 1907.
Okay.
And he's 1906.
And your mother's Welsh, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you and Stefan have a connection there.
Oh, right, okay. There you go. I might not sound it, but yeah, because being brought up in Abu Dhabi, it was quite an anglicised place, what with the visitors, and people even back then were buying houses in Abu Dhabi, and there was a lot of English people who lived there, whereas you'd only need to go sort of 10 miles inland or slightly north to get into the hinterland where Welsh was spoken all the time. I did learn Welsh in school as a non-Welsh speaker. You had the Welsh speaking Welsh, and then you had the non-Welsh speaking Welsh, and I did do up to, as we called it in those days, O-levels. At 16. So
we've talked about Stan as a sailor, as a singer, as a painter, as a performer, and as a scholar. But what was he like as a dad?
Oh, geez. Now there's a question. Yeah, he was. He was a very good dad. It must be said, we never had a lot in the way of money. The Outward Bound was not a big payer, and I don't think it's a big payer even today. I don't think anybody becomes an instructor in the Outward Bound for the money. really, really not. But he did have these other sidelines. I meant, you mentioned about languages. He would do this sort of translating, so that helped bring money into the coffers. So when we were old enough to learn instruments and things, he would have absolutely no compulsion in actually buying us instruments. Like he bought my brother a bass guitar, he bought me a drum kit, and I already had the mandolin from my uncle. Bought us a couple of guitars, and I don't know whether you can see just behind me. There's like a lute type of thing behind there, a lute guitar.
No, that's a schooner.
No, that's with the sky. Oh, very funny. Yeah. Did you recognise what sort of schooner it is, by the way?
I feel like I might.
Go on then. I'd have to say it's not a good representation, but it is a representation.
I mean, it looks like a. Well, from our perspective, I feel like I have to say it looks like a blue nose type.
That's exactly it. And you might know, you probably don't even notice there, but there's a little sort of red flag flying from the main peak.
I can barely make it out.
Yeah, that's the Canadian flag.
All right.
That's the pre-19, was it 59 one, where it had the green maple leaf on the bottom of the shield, because I think it was changed to a red maple leaf until 1965, and then you had, then it changed to the horrible flag. No, as a child, I was into all things Canadian. The Canadian Pacific Railway, Canadian Pacific, steamers. I wanted to be a Mountie. I actually had a Mountie uniform. And so Canada was. I don't know why. I can't even explain why that was, but Canada had a great fascination for me. And so it was a great disappointment when they changed the flag. Because I must have been a very strange child.
On behalf of all Canadians, I just want to say sorry for that. So
it's the only flag we remember, though.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Because I am, as they say in Birmingham, considerably older than you.
I'm sorry. I feel like I interrupted. You were talking about your lute.
Oh no! I was just saying that was probably the last instrument that my dad bought for me, and then I got a job. I started and I could buy my own instruments then, but that was so that was probably the last one that he bought for us. But it was he never stinted in from that respect. I would say that. Encouragement in music. I'm not sure how much he encouraged us to play, but certainly he encouraged us in the fact that he actually bought us instruments, to play. Because I was a drummer in a rock band in school. My brother was a bass player in that same rock band, and one of the songs that we actually sang, going back to the earlier days, was a song called Whip Jamboree, and that really came from Stan's friendship with the group The Spinners, and fortunately we got to know them all, especially Tony Davis, got to know very, very well, and we had the Spinners songbook, and that almost became a bit of a Bible for us. As well as doing the rock stuff, also doing the folk stuff. So songs like Marco Polo that Huey Jones had written, The Champion of the Seas, I think was another one that he'd basically changed around for the Spinners, and I say Jamboree.
With Jamboree, oh, you big sail sailor, hanging down behind. With Jamboree. Oh, Jenny, your old game's done. And now take clear tomorrow night, and we'll steer a course for the Rock Point light. Oh, Jenny, get your old cakes done. With John Marie, oh, you pigtail sailor, hanging now behind. With John Marie, oh, Jenny, get your old cakes done.
So a lot of those sort of songs were coming into our repertoire even sort of back then, really.
Now that makes me think that I think there is a connection here. I know Stan often talked about the importance of Liverpool for sea shanties, being sort of the spiritual home of the shanty, but also all these sailors coming from all around the world, but especially that
melting pot.
Yeah, exactly, a melting pot. Yeah, especially that connection with New York and Liverpool, the regular shipments coming in. And I remember hearing one of the reasons why skiffle took off in Britain in the 60s or so. It was these sailors going to yard sales in the States, and who wants these 20-year-old sort of country and western 45s or 78s. So they could buy them really cheap in the States and sell them off in Liverpool as a sort of novelty record that no one's heard of. And so all that sort of recycled old junk from the States was finding a new audience in Liverpool. And when you listen to the early Beatles, they record a version of Maggie May. And then I think on their very last album, they record another version of Maggie May, which is sort of, a nod to their early skiffle days.
Yeah.
But that was, before the internet, before radio was playing any of this stuff, Liverpool was a unique place in that it was acquiring music from distant parts of the world.
Well, yes. I mean, it had, I believe, one of the old, or has one of the oldest Chinese communities.
Yeah, I heard that first Chinatown, and I think the first sort of black community or sizable black community in Europe.
Yeah.
As
well, I think the other city that could make claim to an early black community, obviously, would be Cardiff.
Oh yeah.
Cardiff's Tiger Bay had a very large sort of black community within it. But I mean, they were international ports, weren't they? So I suppose that sort of thing, it was almost bound to happen, really. And obviously, I mean, Liverpool. Well, yes, it imported a hell of a lot, didn't it? But it was, and luckily, I can actually remember because Stan used to take us. When most people were going to nice places on holiday, Stan would be taking us down the docks in Liverpool, and I remember seeing a Canadian Pacific liner. I think it was either the Empress of Canada or the Empress of Britain, with that checkered insignia on the buff-coloured funnel and all white hull, and down at the Gladstone docks, and that was one of my earliest memories of a big liner. Obviously, sailing ships had gone, many years before that.
Incidentally, my dad came to Canada on the Empress of Canada. So.
Yeah, well, fantastic! Isn't that brilliant? What a connection!
Martin, would you sing us another shanty? What was Stan's favorite shanty?
Right, okay. I'm prepared. We made mention of the Afro-Caribbean shanties that Stan picked up in the early 30s, and I don't know if you know this one. I'm not quite sure whether it's Harding. I think it was Harding that he picked it up from, and it's called Way Down in Dixie. Not exactly what you'd call a tuneful shanty, but a hell of a hauling song. You get some real pulls doing that. And so I'll launch into it then. Okay, so way down in Dixie, oh way down Dixie where the cotton grows, sing a song, blow along, whoa. Oh, way down in Dixie, oh way down Dixie where I had a gal, sing a song, blow along, whoa. Oh way down in Dixie, her name it was for Topsail Nell, sing a song, blow along, whoa. Oh, way down in Dixie, she had two black eyes and a broken nose. Sing a song, blow along, whoa. Oh, way down in Dixie, she was so dark she broke my heart. Sing a song, blow along, whoa. Oh, way down in Dixie, but across the world I had to sail. Sing a song, blow along, whoa. Oh, way down down in Dixie, but I'm as tough as a 6-inch nail. Sing a song, blow along. Whoa, way down in Dixie, well, across the world I had to sail. Sing a song, blow along. Whoa, way down in Dixie, but I'm as tough as a 6-inch nail. Sing a song, blow along. Whoa, way down in Dixie, when I got back, she done me down. Sing a song, blow along. Whoa, way down in Dixie, she ran off with a circus clown. Sing a song, blow along. Whoa, way down in Dixie, well, if I could catch that thieving tyke, sing a song, blow along. Whoa, and that's it.
I have to say it's surreal to hear that, because you sound so much like Stan in so many ways, and in those speeches and some of those sort of growls. It's amazing.
Great, glad you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much, Martin. My goodness, I would love to keep chatting, but these other COVID-free people have to run off to a shanty sing, which unfortunately I can't make it to right now. So
I think we'll start the sing with "Blow the Man Down." Just
there you
perfect way to start it.
Absolutely. Well, it's been fantastic talking to you guys.
the pleasure's all ours, and if it didn't come across, like your father is a legendary character to us, so my goodness, what a treat.
Yeah, and lovely to get to know you a little bit too.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
very
sharing
much.
your time and stories. Yeah, we've got to go. Unfortunately, got to go sing some shanties at a brewery right now.
Oh, that's real hard work.
I know.
Yeah, tough job, but somebody's got to do it.
There you go. Thanks so much, Martin. It was lovely to meet you.
Yeah.
See you too.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.
All right. Well, I guess in closing, we wanted to really thank all the guests that we've had, all the people we've met. We have a lot of following up to do, and that I think we mentioned meeting with in person almost everybody with whom we spoke. So we have set ourselves up for years of some traveling and experiencing this kind of thing in person, and hopefully we actually managed to pull some of that off. Yeah, and thanks to everybody who's been listening. This has been our way of trying to make a contribution during a time where we can't get out in public and sing together. And, you know, hopefully that period of time is coming to a close. Let's all hope. But what a great thing it has ended up being, that we have had these conversations that we otherwise never would have had. Even if we were with these people at a festival, we might have been in the same room with them, but not had the chance to sit together and have a conversation that goes for an hour or two. And yeah, it's been a really fine outcome, I'd say. So yeah.
Yeah, well said. Thank you everyone for listening, and thanks for joining us, all the guests, and let's start booking like 24 plane tickets or whatever.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
All right, bye everyone.
Thanks, Tim.
Take care.
Although times was hard and the wages low, but now once more ashore we'll go, and it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. All the voyage is done and the winds don't blow, and it's time for us to leave her. Oh, the work was hard and the voyage was long. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Aye, before we go, we'll sing this song, and it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. For the voyage is done and the wind don't blow, and it's time for us to leave her. Oh, pray may we never be. Leave her, Johnny, leave on a hungry bitch, the likes of she, and it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. The fight is done, and the wind don't blow, and it's time for us to leave her. Oh, the rats have gone, and we the crew. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, it's time, by God, that we went too, and it's time